Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Matt VanVolkenburg. Now, Matt has spent a huge amount of time in South Korea, blogging on the intricacies of its culture, and has focused his postgraduate research on a strangely overlooked aspect of South Korean culture in the 1960s and 1970s. This was the emergence of a universally recognizable youth culture. This culture began leaching out onto the streets of South Korea through radio broadcasts and changing ideas about how people should exist within the society. Parental authority was being corroded. There was a challenge to traditional values. People more and more wanted to choose where they lived, what job they had, and who they married. And this began to immediately express itself through music, fashion, and drug use. In the late 1960s, indigenous Korean bands were first cutting their teeth on American army bases, and then gradually moving out into the broader society. This was a Western-styled, American-styled rock and roll, along with the sexualized imagery of girl bands, miniskirts, and bikinis. Just as it was outside Korea, youth culture inside Korea was in many ways also a sexual revolution. The art of the time began to reflect this. People were expressing themselves in new ways, all the while shocking the older generation and shocking those in government. And there are some quite recognizable parallels from this to the West. The scandal that long hair on male musicians first had, the fear that people had of women drinking, having premarital sex, and of youth in general being exposed to the risque, the new, and the avant-garde. And pushing this all along was music. There were large-scale, day-long rock and roll concerts that attracted international bands. Foreign musicians were being mobbed at airports just as the Beatles were around the world. And as this was all being expressed out on the streets, on the beaches, through magazines, through TV, along for the ride was the use of drugs, specifically marijuana. And this is where some of the fear begins to come from. Koreans were looking outwards to Europe, to America, and associating youth culture with hippie culture. And by hippie culture, they saw violence. They saw subversiveness, social crimes, extreme drug use, and of course the much publicized crimes of people such as Charles Manson. So a clash with government was coming. Youth culture had ascended, and despite some of the pushbacks, it was still on the rise. But in 1972, the Park Chung-hee government took a turn towards complete authoritarian rule. It imposed martial law, with it a new constitution, and made Park president for life. Almost immediately, arrests for crimes against public morals skyrocketed. Young men were being dragged off the streets and having their hair forcibly cut in barbershops. Newspapers that criticized this were being silenced. Songs that were considered of ill repute were banned outright. Students were forced en masse into the defense corps, and all student organizations were closed overnight. From all sides, youth culture was under attack. Communist, anti-communist, and everything in the middle. And this pushback came from a centuries-old idea, a centuries-old fear, that with Western technology, which was of course considered necessary, there was also the danger of the loss of Korean indigenous culture. The authorities were fearful that with modernization and with this rise of youth culture, they would lose Korean culture. And one of the most extraordinary aspects of this research by Matt is just the level and the degree of how this youth culture was suppressed. In many places around the world, the hippie culture simply died a natural death. In South Korea, it was squashed, which of course offers some very interesting thoughts for the nature of Korean society today and what, if anything, managed to survive. Now, this podcast is still in its recruitment drive, so if you enjoy the content, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached below, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. So on that, and without any further delay, this is Matt VanVolkenburg. Matt VanVolkenburg, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. So today we're going to be speaking about this rise and I suppose this fall as well of youth culture in South Korea. But we should go back a little bit and talk about some of the, the pre-echoes and some of the themes that are going to run into this movement. So I guess first, take us back to 1876 and to Kim Ko-jong and this idea of Eastern morals, Western technology.
Well, at the time, there were a lot of responses as to how to deal with the Japanese, with Japanese penetration into Korea, and whether to even sign Korea's first modern treaty with them. And a lot of the critics, like Chae Ik-hyun, they thought that basically there was no difference between the Japanese and the West, that Japan had sort of betrayed its heritage by becoming completely Western. And so he thought there was no real way to separate the basically Western culture from Western technology. And for example, he said, as soon as we allow these trade goods to come in, they're going to be hiding Bibles in them. And so I think he's basically making the argument there, you cannot separate these two forms of knowledge. Whereas King Kojong thought that no, and these ideas kind of developed in China first, I think, and they developed in Japan as well. The whole idea that no, we can separate these two forms of knowledge. We can import their technology and their techniques, but we can keep out this, what for them that was considered dangerous was Christianity. It was a threat to the Confucian system. And so he thought that no, we can separate these two things and we don't have to worry about it. So we can make this treaty with Japan, and as he put, like, no damage will be done to propriety.
So was this an idea, I suppose, that there was a fear inside Korea that they needed to modernize, but was it a fear of losing their own identity of sorts?
That's something that has continued from that time, even up to the present. Yes, absolutely. Kojong is sometimes derided as not being willing to modernize, but that's not true. Certainly initially, he was fairly well read about the West. He was trying to keep an eye on what was going on, and he thought that Korea did need to develop. But especially after the attempted coup d'etat in 1884, then which was carried out by the progressives, after that he started to back away a little bit. He thought that too much modernization might be disruptive.
So with that in hand, this idea that you want as much Western influence as you can, but not so much the Western culture, let's move forward a little bit to something I've heard you spoken about a couple of times. In the 1920s and the 1930s, this rise of, I guess it's being called in some ways, the modern girl.
Well, especially that began developing in Japan, and Japan by the 1920s had a much more developed commercial culture. There was a lot more money there, more consumerism. But in Korea, it wasn't, in the 1920s, it wasn't quite as developed. It was more reflected in the fashion. But the idea of sort of the new women or the modern girl was the idea that they could be somewhat independent. But this, like especially in choice of marriage and in choice of romantic partners, and the idea that they should be able to divorce, that they shouldn't be locked into relationships that kept them powerless. But a lot of the time this was more reflected in consumer choices and dressing in Western styles, having Western style haircuts, and often it was derided as just being just obsessed with money and with jewelry, and there are a number of movies, especially Sweet Dream from 1936 or 37, portrays a woman who leaves her family behind to go shack up with another man, and they go dancing and they drink beer and they go shopping, and she's seen as being just obsessed with consumer goods and with money, and is abandoning her traditional role. And that kind of tension exists even up to the present. If you look at, within the last 10 years, there was the rise of the daenjangnya, or the bean paste girl. The girls, especially university students or young women, who are just seen with Starbucks coffee cups, and they spend more money on clothes and handbags and Starbucks coffee than they do on eating, say. They just want to look good. So this tension has existed for a long time.
So back in the 1920s and 1930s, when this first arrives, was this being felt on the streets in Korea and seen on the streets in Korea, or was it something that was just sort of filtering in from outside media and people were looking at it as like a scary specter haunting over Korea, or was it something that was actually on the ground at the time?
I think in the 1920s it wouldn't have been quite so obvious, really. I mean, I think it's something that's more of a specter that you see in the media, and I think that's something you see throughout Korea's development, even in the colonial period and up through the 60s, 70s to the present, is the media covering what's going on in the outside world, and it either being held up as something that is interesting and good and should be adopted in Korea, and when it does appear in Korea, they say, it's finally appeared here, or it's held up, as you said, as a specter, as something to be afraid of, and they're on the lookout for it. And sometimes, I mean, it might not even be there yet, but they'll find any shred of evidence and hold it up for the audience to see and say, like, this is something that must be stopped. So I think at that time it's more of a specter. As you move into the 1930s, I think you start to see it more, but it's still a small part of the population that we're talking about.
So with those two flag posts in hand, let's move forward to the 1960s and this rise of youth culture that you write and you speak about so well. So Park Chung-hee is in power, and one of the early sort of unintentional proponents of this, one of the things that spreads this throughout the community, is the rise of radios. And if I'm not wrong here, Park Chung-hee and his government distributed these things as a modernizing attempt, but it had backfired on them in some ways.
Right. Certainly in 1962, I forget the exact number, but it was something like 100,000 radios they planned to distribute to villages throughout the country, which they hoped would basically act as a transmission belt. But of course, there are commercial interests. There's several radio stations starting to develop, and of course they're playing music. And the anthropologist Vincent Brandt wrote that in 1966 he was doing research in a very remote village on the west coast of Korea, and he said at that time that sort of not just adults but also just very young adults in their 20s had noted this very sudden appearance of this new youth culture, and he said that by 1966, maybe a quarter of the population of this village had radios, which was a fairly new thing. I mean, Korea's electronics industry was just developing at the time. But he said it was the messages in the radio dramas and in the songs of romantic love that, he said, made this kind of dent on parental authority, because they started to get these messages and think, well, I should be able to choose my own marriage partner, and I should be able to work where I want, and I shouldn't have to maybe listen to my parents so much. And he said a lot of as this change was happening, instead of focusing so much on their family, which traditionally, even young adults, when they were working, before they got married, they would be living with their family, so they would be turning over their earnings to their parents. But here you start to see this rise of, consumerism and this desire for, say, new clothes or trips to town or sunglasses or even acoustic guitars.
And specifically, this youth culture that was beginning to leach its way into Korea, is it American, is it European, or is it some sort of collaboration of the both? What exactly, how can we pin this down in the outside world?
A lot of it was very American influenced. There were also European influences. One of the main influences was the U.S. military presence, and there were sort of twofold influences there. One was around the U.S. bases were the camp towns, and there were a lot of bars and clubs that developed there, and there were a lot of Korean musicians who wanted to work, especially in the 1950s when there really wasn't much work, when the economy was really struggling post-war in South Korea. the one place where musicians could get work was working for the U.S. military. And in fact, those working in the camp towns were the lowest rung. There was a whole system set up in which the musicians could basically audition, and the best groups would be sent to play for the officers, and then the lower rung would be playing for the men on the bases, and then the other people would be playing just on the outside of the bases in the camp towns. So you had this direct influence kind of radiating from the camp towns there, but the other more direct influence was AFKN radio, which anyone with a radio could listen to, and so they would be able to hear a lot of American music. And even by the early 60s, there was also AFKN TV, and that's a very, very small subset of the Korean population would have had TVs at the time. But in 1964, for example, one man wrote in the Korea Times a column about the influence of AFKN TV on his family. And one small example was of this, his son walked up to him one day and gave him a little punch on the shoulder, and he kind of angrily looked at him and said, "What did you do that for?" And he said, "Well, everyone does it." And he's like, "Well, everyone who?" And he's like, "Well, like the son on, I think maybe Gunsmoke or one of the shows like that." And he said, "Oh, okay." And so he talked about just how much his family liked watching these American shows. So you have these different levels of penetration. Obviously, the TV would be the highest, income section of the population. Radio would be sort of the middle, and then around the camp towns would be much more localized.
So I'm glad you brought music into this here, because for people, of course, they can't see the images, but I'll put some links below this podcast so people can find the images that you put online. The images look a lot like what you'd imagine the Western youth culture in the 60s and 70s were. It almost emulates it perfectly, at least in appearance. And a lot of the music seems to do the same thing. So you look at these bands, and as you said, they started off not particularly doing that well. They struggled in the early days, but they were reminiscent. They looked like the Beatles, and they looked like some of the girl bands. And but some of these early bands, such as I put down here a couple of times, the Korean Kittens, things like this, they do get a little bit of traction and become a little bit famous at this time, and in some ways are a pre-echo of modern K-pop in a way as well.
Well, yeah, it was interesting because the Korean Kittens played they played overseas. I think it was about 1964 or so. They were doing "Can't Buy Me Love" on, I think, the BBC. There's a video on YouTube of that. In 1967, they were playing the Bob Hope special at one of his concerts in Vietnam. And the Korean Kittens at one point sing this song, and as soon as the singer, Yoon Bo-ki, opens her mouth and starts singing, you're just blown away by this soulful voice. You wouldn't imagine it. And and it was interesting about her as well, is when she went back to Korea, at a fashion show, she was the first model to wear a miniskirt. That's 1967, and that was quite risque at the time. Though even the newspaper said, she looked so good in them that it almost gave people the idea that it was okay to wear miniskirts. And then within 2 years, 3 years, you started to see a lot of, well, certainly not everyone, but a noticeable subset of the population wearing miniskirts.
Well, let's talk through that idea about miniskirts then, because this is one of the, I guess for people listening, they know how this is going to end. It's not going to be a great outcome for this youth revolution. But miniskirts is one of those aspects that when it starts, people have this same sort of pushback when they think, okay, it's fine, but it's not for our Korean women. But like you said, within a few years, the battle was almost lost on this one.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the things that really the youth culture really starts to take off in 68, 69, and really starts to take off in 1970, I think. But really tied into that were the newspaper weeklies. And the first weekly newspaper was in 1964, the weekly Hanguk, which the Hanguk Ilbo published. But it really started to take off in 1968 when the Seoul Shinmun started publishing Sunday Seoul. And after that, all of these other weeklies started to appear. And they, gave a great deal of coverage, usually 2-page stories, but sometimes they would have specials where they would have several stories adding up to 6 or 8 pages. And lots of photos, and as time went on, lots of color photos. And so when you're looking at these kind of magazines, which brought in a lot of fashion and reports on entertainers and music, and you see lots of miniskirts in these fashion spreads. I'm not sure at that point just how popular they were. Certainly, I think by the early and mid-'70s, they'd become popular enough, especially with young women. But when it first started in 1967, I think it was about May or so, not too long after this fashion show early that year, that Andre Kim and another designer in the women's magazine Yeowon, or some Women's Garden, they had a discussion on the pros and cons of miniskirts. And Andre Kim, he did not think they were for Korean women. As you said, he was one of those people who thought it's not really for us, whereas the other designer thought, they were just fine. And obviously Korean women agreed with that, and they started to become popular.
And you can't really have a youth revolution without a sexual revolution at the same time, at least as we've seen it in the West. And this, from an idea of miniskirts, a new idea begins to grow, a lot more risque. So I think it's 1968 you begin to see the rise of body painting. And I guess for people with memories of the 60s and 70s, this sort of nude body painting was incredibly popular in the West. And it was so, at least becoming so, inside this youth culture in South Korea.
Yeah, I mean, the body painting was a part of sort of the avant-garde art at the time, and or the experimental art. And yeah, the first body painting that was reported on that I found was in 1968 in Incheon, when a British body painter painted on his girlfriend in an exhibit at a hotel in Incheon, and it said, in respect of Korean customs, she was wearing like a bikini, and but it's interesting because the article said it said something along the lines of, "At last, body painting has appeared in Korea," so as if they were expecting that it would arrive, and maybe even anticipating it, and then after that, there were other, I'm trying to think, who was it? Suddenly her name escapes me, which is terrible, but there was a female artist, and she took part in the first nude happening in, I think it was May or June of 1968, which took place at a club that became known, very much associated with folk music, Sibon, which was downtown Seoul, which is where all of the clubs were at the time. And she was covered with these balloons. I mean, she was wearing underwear, but otherwise was naked. And then, so I guess people went and affixed these balloons to her body, and then came up and popped them. And at the time, there was this loud music playing. And the Korea Times gave a very critical review of that show, saying, "Oh, it was happening all right." But so this was something that was kind of, it was off on the side, but the newspaper weeklies were reporting on it. The news was reporting on it, so it's out there. People know that it's happening, and she appeared in a several-page spread in Sunday Seoul in November of 1968, almost naked. Well, in fact, yeah, some of the photos from certain angles, she was naked being painted, and then she was wearing a sort of see-through, she was wearing a skirt and then a see-through shirt. Of course, the thing about these newspaper weeklies is they loved the female form. There was actually a fair amount of nudity, which kind of surprised me. There were centerfolds, color photos, and Sunday Soul specialized in Korean models, while other magazines would have more Western models, which were usually, these photos were provided by Associated Press. So a lot of what could be seen as these sexist attitudes towards white women were simply recreating the attitudes that existed at the time in the West.
So I'm glad you mentioned there that idea of these clubs in Seoul, because it has a sort of analogous look back to the early rise of rock music in the West, things like the Cavern Club in Liverpool where the Beatles started. And we have these sort of images around Seoul too, such as the Cosmos Club as well. And inside these places is something that, of course, was quite scandalous at the time, though it might not feel that at the moment, but this rise of long hair on male musicians.
Right. That, that had been happening, especially for the musicians playing in the camp towns. One of the best-known bands, if I remember correctly, they were from Daegu. They were called Last Chance. An article in early 1970 commented on sort of this new trend of long hair on men, and they were really highlighted because I think it even measured their hair. It said the longest hair in Korea, 42 centimeters. And even earlier in late 1969, and there was an article just on, like, it's kind of presented as being a little strange that these men are going to more like the Myeongshil, like the hairdressers, to have their, at the time, it's quite short, it's not that long at all, but it's certainly longer than what was acceptable at the time. But certainly by the spring of 1970, even the newspapers are starting to talk about it a little bit, and I remember one letter writer in one of the newspapers said, like, I'm afraid these kind of hippies will start to appear in Korea, and but by the summer of 1970, it had become noticeable enough that the government began to take action.
And that's an important point there, because we're talking about youth culture here, but many people began to see the rise of, I suppose hippie culture is what it was called, but hippie culture as an extreme outgrowth of youth culture. And of course, that is mixed in with all sorts of fears, such as Charles Manson and violence and subversive, unethical crimes as well. So they're not the same thing, those two particular cultures.
Well, one of the first, I guess you could say, like journal articles written about youth culture was by Nam Jae-hee, who was writing for he was an editorial writer for the Joseon Ilbo at the time. And ironically, I was actually studying at the University of Washington under Hwasuk Nam. So when I was talking to her about this, she said, "Oh, that's my father." So it's a bit of a small world. But yeah. There had been an earlier discussion at the Christian Academy in mid-1969 about youth culture, and in which different professors and journalists talked about this, what they saw as, in a way, they're talking about the burgeoning youth culture in Korea. Well, I don't know so much about that. I think they're more talking about what's happening in the West and applying it to Korea, and I'm not sure that it was really, I'm not sure to what degree it was really noticeable at that time, but they were sort of anticipating it. But by 1970, the newspapers and the weeklies are all starting to talk about it appearing in Korea. And in Nam Jae-hee's article, he thought that generally youth culture was a positive thing, and it would sort of energize the youth and motivate them, and that it would make them more free to develop, and that these were good things. But he thought that basically hippie culture was an extreme version of youth culture, and he said, some aspects of youth culture, I think the older generation can agree with, that these qualities are good. But then other things like free sex or student power, as he put it, and I love this term, are maybe seen as ideologically insoluble.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But so on that, I mean, that sings to me a little bit like a moral panic. And of course, you can see the moral panic when people are scared of this hippie invasion coming across. But on the actual streets of Seoul, it may, once again, it may not feel that concerning today. But some of the concerns that people were seeing, just as you mentioned there, were things such as things as simple as men and women drinking together, females writing books, sex in novels, or high school students dating each other.
Right. And it's interesting. I mean, these were discussed, especially in the Sunday Soul had a column in it was a weekly magazine, and it was called Chungchun Ilbanji, which you could translate as sort of number one youth street. And every week they would invite a panel of speakers. And sometimes, they could be university students, it could be maybe some professors, sometimes it was celebrities and musicians, and they would discuss different topics. But it becomes very clear that this burgeoning youth culture, and it's very much connected with consumerism, because like you say, to be out drinking together, to be able to afford that, you needed money. And so there's definitely this overlap between student culture, especially we're talking university student culture, and I mean, to be able to afford a university at the time, you're talking about the upper crust of Korean society. And so there's this overlap between the student culture and this burgeoning youth culture, and a lot of this is, it's very much connected with consumerism and being able to spend money. And so a lot of the topics that they discussed, as you said, were, yes, men and women drinking together, is this all right? And and even talking about, depictions of sex in novels. A couple of young university co-eds were saying that they thought nudity, like nude scenes in films, they thought, well, they're not so bad. And which I'm sure to some people was quite scandalous.
And something else that was quite scandalous at the time, and of course it was scandalous in the West when it first emerged, a little bit earlier, was the bikini. And of course, at the same time, there are these images, I suppose very analogous to the West, of men on the beaches with their shirts off, something you won't see in South Korea today, not very common at all. But there was the emergence of the bikini, I guess at least as a fashion trend. Whether or not people were wearing them widely, it was emerging, and this was seen as once again, just another way to sexualize this younger generation.
That's right. I mean, along with miniskirts, it was interesting. There was an article I believe it was in the summer of 1970, in which the police were noting a rise in teen sex crimes, and they suggested the possibility of a miniskirt ban because they thought this exposure was causing these crimes. But the bikinis, you certainly see them, with Korean models wearing them certainly in 1969 to a small degree. You see more of that in 1970, but it's in 1971 that you really start to see just photos taken on beaches of just regular women and even like teenage girls wearing bikinis. And it's not, I mean, you don't really see bikinis that much today. I mean, maybe it's starting to change, but for the most part, if women go to the beach, they'll have a bikini on, but they'll have, a skirt over it, or shorts, or definitely a t-shirt over the top. So it's a lot more, in some ways, conservative today. And when I asked a friend about this, what he thought, why this had changed, he just thought it was much more concerned with body image today, and much more reticent to show off bodies than in the past, when there wasn't such concern about that, really.
And underscoring all of this, I mean, when you speak to people who grew up in the 60s and 70s like my parents did, they had a very clear idea of what they were doing. At least, I mean, it may not be easily expressible, but they had an idea of what this youth revolution was all about. There were ideas like liberation from old social structures and freedom of expression, freedom of the individual, self-determination. Was this the same sort of ideology that was coursing the South Koreans, or was it something different?
I mean, those ideas are present. Certainly, one of the ideas was the ability to choose your own marriage partner, and sort of freedom of choice there. Possibly freedom of choice in what kind of job you want or where you want to live. But I think in many ways, it's more the consumerist aspects. It's more the fashion choices that were, I think those were kind of chosen as the markers of being modern. I'm not sure to what degree that kind of revolution in values was widespread in Korea that you saw in the West.
Do you think that was in any way influenced by, I guess, at the same time there was a rise of technology? So you're seeing color magazines and things like this, and these, of course, were very important for these movements. So do you think there's any sort of link between the two, that the idea of beginning to see fashion in color, you can then sort of co-opt the movement, or at least take control of the movement?
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the influence of those color images, but they were certainly in those magazines, and it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I think the other technical advances that would have been really important would have been probably radios. Certainly musically, the LPs were growing in popularity, but that's still a small subset of the population at that time that could afford a record player. More likely, there were a lot of music listening rooms where young people could go in, and there'd be a library there, and they could listen to music. Or there were the tabangs, the tea rooms, where there would be a little DJ booth, and people could go in and request songs. So I think that certainly musically, those would have been the technical advances. Because even when you think about these magazines, they were no doubt influential, but I wonder to what degree. I've never actually, I haven't had time to actually look into their circulation, but I'm sure for most of the population that it would have been too expensive to buy a magazine.
You mentioned music again there, and this is something important to bring up here, because the music changes a lot at this time. As you mentioned, people listen to it on radios and things like this and get new access to it. But there's also the rise of something that is, once again, has a direct link to the Western idea of this rise of youth culture, which is these large international music festivals out on large lawns, Woodstock-styled things. And this amazing moment in 1969, I believe, when Cliff Richard arrives in Seoul, and there's the same mass hysteria of screaming young girls at the airport, just as we've seen for the Beatles again and again and again.
Right. I mean, I think in some ways, if you wanted to date the moment when people really realize, oh, there's something going on here, I think that could be the moment when Cliff Richard comes. And when he arrives at the airport, there are, I think, a couple hundred teenage girls. They're waiting for him, holding signs, saying, "I love you, Cliff." And when he tried to leave the airport, they basically, they mobbed him and were surrounding him. And there's even stories of some wayward lasses throwing their underwear at him. And I guess riot police had to be brought in to push the girls away. And then they got on buses and followed him into town. And then he had 3 concerts, which were over capacity. I mean, there were 3,500 at the first 2 concerts, which were at Citizens Hall, which was where a lot of these big music festivals in Seoul took place. And it stood where the Sejong Cultural Center stands today. and then he did another concert at Ewha University. And at that time, it caused a bit of, there was a YMCA citizens forum where there was a debate about the behavior of these girls at the Cliff Richard concert. And one of the women who was there, who was an author, she thought it was fine. There's nothing unwholesome about the songs or the girls' behavior. Whereas, interestingly, when I first did this research, I didn't know who this person was, and then as I learned who he was later and went back and read it, I realized, oh, okay, this was Han Tong-se, who was a Seoul National University professor, a psychiatrist who had studied in the West, in the U.S., and had written papers like sexual perversion in Korea, and he thought that their behavior was very unnatural, and that a blind following of Western ideas should be avoided.
So let's move on to, I guess, one of the last elements in this youth culture before we talk about the crackdown on it. And of course, this is important because it becomes one of the driving forces in the crackdown, and that is drugs. So I guess specifically marijuana. So let's take us back to, I guess, the history of marijuana. In my understanding, I saw you speak about it previously. The marijuana, in many ways, had always existed in South Korea, but it was an unfashionable drug used by the old farmers. So for a long time, the youth wouldn't touch it. And then it becomes brought back in through American GIs in the Korean War and thereafter.
That's right. I've talked to a number of former Peace Corps volunteers who were here in the late 60s and early 70s, and they said at that time it was quite common to see, elderly men and women smoking it, because it was just a very easily available medicine, essentially, because hemp was growing all over the place. Though there was certainly a taboo against young people using it. And as well, it was just seen as grandma's medicine. But the first GIs to come across marijuana in Korea was in the prisoner of war camps in North Korea, where, according to one former prisoner there, an American, he said the Turkish soldiers showed them how to find it, dry it, and smoke it. And he said, it's a really good thing we had it, because there were guys who just refused to eat any more rice, and he said, we get them high as a kite and they'd think they were eating a steak. And but by the early 60s, I don't know to what degree it was that popular in the 50s, but by the early 60s, I've come across stories of soldiers smoking it, and Koreans were, once they realized there was a market for it, they would just go to farmers and say, oh, can we have the top of your hemp plants when you're done with them? Which to the farmers, it was generally garbage. I mean, some of it was used medicinally, but most of it was just thrown away. So they were happy to be paid a bit of money, and these guys would take it, and there'd be a massive markup. And they would put it in, they would take cigarette packs, basically empty the cigarettes of tobacco, and then stuff it full of marijuana, reseal the packet, and then sell them. And they were known as, these packs were known as Happy Smoke. And they could be bought, I think it was maybe 100 won or 200 won a pack, so it was fairly cheap. And this had been going on, certainly I've read accounts from the early 60s of this happening, but it's not until 1966 that the US starts to realize there's a problem. And the main problem was they realized that this wasn't some imported marijuana, that this was Korean marijuana that was being smoked. The Korean response then was surprise, like, what? Our hemp has psychoactive properties? It can't be. And the problem was that the reason these could be sold was a loophole in the law, the narcotics law, which was passed in 1957, and only essentially imported marijuana was, which they called Indosan, or Indian marijuana, was considered a drug. Hanguksan, or Korean-grown marijuana, was not considered a drug. And so the U.S., about 1968 or so, at a status of forces agreement meeting with the Korean military, they made a request, like, we've heard talk that you're maybe thinking of changing the law, like, could you maybe hurry this along? And according to Stars and Stripes, an article a year or so later, by 1970, this bill that had been introduced into the National Assembly for consideration had been sitting around for about 2 years, but it hadn't been passed. And you see the number of GIs being caught by the U.S. military for marijuana use climbing. I think by 1969 or so, it was about maybe 600 GIs had been caught. And so the U.S. started putting more pressure on Korea to pass this bill. But what was interesting was that there was actually a murder in 1970 in March, which was quite brutal. A Korean couple living near a U.S. base in Dongducheon were murdered because they wouldn't allow these soldiers to buy marijuana on credit. And I mean, they had their throats slit, and it was quite brutal. And so that came up in the news. But it quickly disappeared in the Korean language news media, though there were some crackdowns around the American bases. There wasn't a lot of attention paid. But then suddenly in June, or early June 1970, all of the Korean media started reporting on the problem of marijuana. And what's interesting is that this followed about a day after the first confirmation that basically a division of American troops was going to be pulled out of Korea as part of the Nixon Doctrine. And then after that, things moved very quickly, and by July, I think it was July 17th, 1970, marijuana was made illegal at last.
But outside of those American instances themselves, there's a fear, and as you mentioned there's wide reporting on this fear that marijuana is on the campuses and everyone's engaging in this happy smoke, as it came to be called. But I saw you mention once before that when people actually went out on the street, there's an instance of an organization. Can't quite recall who it was, but people on the street trying to suss out just how prevalent the use of marijuana was. And they would ask people on the street whether they used it or whether they had it. And basically, it was close to non-existent. It was very hard to find.
Right. I think certainly I think probably people around the American bases might have been smoking it. The band, certainly, I believe it was in June of 1970, Shin Jung-hyun, who's considered the godfather of rock and roll in Korea, who got his start playing for the U.S. military. He wrote this very evocative story of the first time he had smoked marijuana a year or two before. So it was certainly going around in musician circles, but use among students, it was quite small. And it was what you were thinking of there was actually Stars and Stripes in July of 1970. They decided to try and figure out just how popular marijuana was. So according to these news articles, you could find it in tea rooms in Myeongdong or Chungmuro. So they basically, I guess they had Koreans go with them, and they went and tried to score some marijuana in this area. But they said, we spent hours there and couldn't find any. The police there had never heard of anyone using it. They talked to students on campuses, like they went to some, big meeting of student representatives from several campuses, and they asked, is this common? Is this really happening? And, people said no, and they quizzed, they said about 50 students, and they said maybe one or two of them said they'd tried it. So the Stars and Stripes article was basically making the argument that it really wasn't a problem at all, and that it's probably more likely that it was the decision to make marijuana illegal was a political decision made to appease the U.S.
But despite that, it seems that youth culture kept rolling forward. And until this point, people listening may think this sounds a lot like youth culture in the West. There's no particular difference here. But in 1970, August 29, 1970, there's a long sort of brewing clash with the government that is coming along here. And of course, South Korea at the time is largely authoritarian. And there's this immediate breakup on the streets where police come onto the streets, they pull off young men and pull them into barbershops and forcibly cut their hair.
That's right. And what's interesting is that came very suddenly. There was no warning. And it caused, there was a lot of discussion in the media about the pros and cons of this. And generally, while there were certainly people who thought, these kids are ugly and their long hair, I'm glad they're getting their hair cut. Generally, there was criticism, especially like amongst lawyers and legal types. They thought that it was, they said, I might not like it, but I don't think police power should be used in this way. And Lee Sang-nok, who's written sort of from the perspective of mass dictatorship theory, he thought that this crackdown on long hair was sort of an omen of the coming dictatorship, of the worsening of the dictatorship and the start of the Yushin system. But there were a lot of cartoons that really poked fun at what the police were doing. In one case, the police push all these men with long hair into a police station, and the police chief there is holding up a pair of clippers and says, any men here who are imitating women, we're going to cut your hair right now. And one of them puts her hand up, and it's a woman, and she's like, but Dad, it's me. And he's like, well, it's my daughter. So
yes, yeah, no, it's a very interesting image, this, but and I've seen you write about this, the actual article for which a lot of this was being charged under. It wasn't so much a specific law, but Article 27, which simply said, for arousing anxiety and disgust in others. So it's a moral outrage. It's a social and moral crime, not so much a legal infraction. That's that well thought out.
Right. Yeah, they tried to apply a few different. That was the main one. They applied a few other statutes as well. But what's interesting is there were at least two cases I found in the media where judges threw out the they threw out the cases. They said, one of them said that the law is not applicable in this way, and the other just said, well, there's no evidence that he was arousing disgust in people. So I thought that was quite interesting. And it wouldn't be until 1973 that they amended the misdemeanors law, where they had a legal basis. And from that point, it really increases. You see, I think in 1973, about 100,000 people had their hair cut, 140,000 the next year. And then once the crackdowns really started in 1975, in the first half of 1976 alone, 600,000 people were caught. So clearly it wasn't working. It was a popular style by that point.
And I suppose we should mention here that in 1972, Park Chung-hee imposes martial law and brings in a new constitution, making himself president for life. And at that point, Korea becomes authoritarian. So in many ways, this sort of crackdown is at least within their grasp. But there's a couple of very interesting moments here that I found interesting from what you had spoken about. And it sort of shows how subtle, how clever authoritarianism can be. And one of them, of course, is this. At one point, 54 musicians and entertainers are arrested, and they're charged, but the charges are often just suspended sentences. But once they're released back into the public, their own organizations, their own union movements that they work under, then impose bans for life on some of them. And this begins, I think, at least for me, it begins to show an insight into how if you squash a culture enough and you push in on it and enough, you don't have to do a lot of the hard policing yourself. Eventually, some of the hard policing will be done by the citizens themselves.
Well, yes, but at the same time, most of these entertainers associations were essentially run by the government. So they were still doing the squashing. It was just a way to deny that they were doing it themselves. And you do see a lot of these denials, like, well, oh no, that wasn't us. I mean, that was the Entertainers Union. But of course, they have control over the Entertainers Union. So
the other moment, of course, is the I guess the Tonga Ilbo, this newspaper that I guess some of the journalists speak out in support of youth culture, and the government, rather than shut them down, pressures advertisers not to advertise with them, and it's largely successful as well.
Right. Well, I would say they were criticizing the government. The thing to remember at that time is that the government basically told newspapers what to report. They gave guidelines every day. They would tell them essentially what pages that certain articles should run on. Of course, they didn't tell them, for everything, but there were main stories where they would say, you're going to report on it in this way. I think they may have even said that these are key phrases. That's my guess, because you see these phrases repeated over and over again. But the Tonga Ilbo in late 1974 and early 1975 decided to basically go against the government and start reporting. And for example, at the time, if there were student protests, the student protests would take place on campuses. They were not allowed to go off campuses. That would bring a very harsh crackdown. But then, because they were on campuses, the public wouldn't really know that they were happening, especially when the newspapers were told not to report on them. So the Tonga Ilbo decides to go against this and start openly reporting on what's going on in Korea and openly criticizing the government. So the government's response, as you said, again, was this indirect way where there's plausible deniability. What? No, we're just like a democracy here. We're not oppressing the press. But they started pressuring the advertisers to start pulling the advertisements, so making it very difficult for the newspaper to keep publishing. But what's actually fascinating at that time was that just normal citizens started buying little tiny pieces of ad space. So where you once would have seen like a third of a page ad, it's now broken up into all these little squares. And it's really interesting to read them, because sometimes you'll see stuff like a little square where it says, like, from the women at this factory who just, donated their lunch money to the Tonga Ilbo just to support them. So it's a really neat moment in the democracy movement. But eventually the government succeeded, and a number of journalists were essentially fired. So again, the government can plausibly deny that they're not actually putting pressure on the newspaper. So basically the same thing happened with all these musicians that the government decided it didn't want in the public sphere. They could be arrested for marijuana. They could be, given a suspended sentence. So they're not actually, other than the pre-trial arrest time, when some of them, like Shin Jung-hyun, were put under water torture. But otherwise, they're not sent to jail. They just use other organizations and indirectly remove them from the public sphere.
And talking about some of the subtleties of this authoritarian crackdown, so as you mentioned there's a ban on criticism of government, but there's also some other, I guess, more subtle methods here. So there's the compulsory enrollment of all students into the Defense Corps, the closing of all student organizations, and two that sounded, to me at least, almost North Korean, the mandatory participation of all households in neighborhood meetings, and the playing every morning throughout all the cities and villages of patriotic songs over loudspeakers.
Right. Yeah. Basically every village not only had a radio, they usually had a speaker system. So every morning, citizens would be woken up, I believe, at 6 a.m. and they would play the national anthem. They would play two songs written by Park Chung-hee, the Seimal song and Nai Joguk, or My Fatherland, which are these very martial songs. And they would play songs like Chao Sarabose, Let's Live Well, and all these pick-me-up, supposedly, pro-government songs. And these, of course, were not just in villages. These were, in cities. City Hall would have speakers blaring this stuff out at 6 a.m. every morning. So that was, certainly that was going on for, I think, from the early 70s. And as well, another thing they did with the crackdown on music was to, after 1975, was to mandate a healthy song on every record album, which usually would be the last song on the album, and people would just skip it. But so there's that, and then the neighborhood meetings were actually they'd gotten their start in the colonial period. The Japanese organized these sort of patriotic neighborhood units in which someone would be put in charge of all these families and would basically be monitoring them for the government. And that they'd say the head of the group would be issuing ration tickets, for example, like during the war. And that practice continued, as you said, in North Korea up to this day, I believe. And in South Korea as well, there were the Aegukban, or the patriotic units, under the Lee Seung-man government. These were discontinued, and then there was a patchwork version of them that existed, but they were reconstituted in 1976, and they were called Pansanghoe. If you mention this to Koreans today, they'll just chuckle, because like every apartment building, has a Pansanghoe once a month where they discuss, where they should put the recycling. It's very mundane. But when it was started in 1976, every household had to send one representative to a local meeting. All of the local meetings were held at the same time on the same day, across the entire country. And these were essentially transmission belts where the government messages were given directly to the people. And the very first one in mid-1976, one of the messages was, we should all keep our hair short.
So from that, this sort of tight crackdown from multiple different areas and different ways, let's look into the future a little bit now. And I guess this is the best way to actually analyze how successful this crackdown on youth culture was. So how do you see that? How do you see it actually going, looking at modern Korean society today? Do you see any elements of this surviving? I suppose the mini skirts are still there, but do you see that this crackdown in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, was it successful by the government, or was it, or did it fail in many ways? And what elements do you think have ran through into modern Korea?
Well, I think the government cracked down on so many different aspects of popular culture. I mean, there was intense censorship of films. As I said, there was the marijuana crackdown in 1975, removed some of the best musicians, songwriters from the public sphere for 4 years until Park Chung-hee died. The song bans instituted around that time continued until 1987. Comic books were cracked down on and heavily controlled. And if you look at Korean popular culture today, I mean, music, movies, comic books are, not just thriving, but are also cultural exports. And it's kind of ironic that as Park Chung-hee was trying to develop the country and saw these basically this popular culture and this incipient youth culture as an impediment to developing the country quickly. If we look in the present, now that popular culture has become something that has given Korea a form of soft power that, Park Chung-hee could never have imagined. So I do think the crackdown did have an effect of basically retarding that development for many years. And I mean, Shin Jung-hyun, for example, complained that the music in the 70s, he thought it was better, it was more complex, it was lyrically more interesting. And he said after the crackdown in 1975, the music just became happier and let's all work hard, and he thought it had kind of dumbed down the music.
But there are some lingering aspects of this, and I suppose this might go back to this fear of losing the indigenous culture. And this, I've seen you write about this a few times, that this is still prevalent in many ways in South Korea, that foreigners are looked upon in some ways as drug users, as sometimes carrying infectious diseases and bringing crime and social misbehavior with them. And that in many ways Koreans still look at foreigners in this way, that it'd be nice to get their skills and their benefits that they bring, but yet still fence off the culture that comes with them.
Right. Yeah. I wrote about media portrayals of English teachers for years, and a lot of the attitudes tied up with the English teachers were also tied up, had appeared earlier when the media was portraying GIs, which they hadn't really been able to usually portray them negatively. There were moments where there was maybe some crime and they would be allowed to, but under the authoritarian governments, they wanted to, try and maintain support for the alliance, so they wouldn't allow criticism so much. But once that started after, or even during the Olympics in 1988, those same tropes of committing crimes and at the time like AIDS and drug use and everything else, those continued through. You could see it with the English teachers. You can see it to varying degrees. I mean, at the moment, there's a whole incipient movement against refugees that portrays them as rapists, and though it's more tied to anti-Islamic feeling, but there is certainly this desire, which goes back a long time. There are these fears of cultural contamination, and I think the most perfect example of this was this is about 6 or 7 years ago. The government started developing English teaching robots, and the idea was that they were going to replace English teachers. They would be remote operated by much cheaper Filipinos. Though, of course, the robots would have a white face on them, and because, of course, race and language often in Korea are linked together, which is one of the reasons people are amazed if a foreigner starts speaking Korean, because they think the Korean language and the Korean race are kind of linked together. But one of the reasons was that the foreign teachers were seen as a possible cultural contaminants, and so they wanted to use Korean technology to basically keep that culture at bay, but just allow the English to come in, which really kind of takes us right back to King Kojong and the Eastern morals and Western technology, except in this case with the Korean technology.
So that might be a good moment to leave this on, actually. So Matt VanVolkenburg, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you for having me.